It is true that blowing up Nord Stream does not help Vladimir Putin. He would not do that. Why would he? But that doesn't mean that other countries wouldn't consider doing it. They would consider it, and we know they have considered it because at least one of them has said so in public. In early February, less than 3 weeks before the war in Ukraine began, Joe Biden suggested on camera that he might take out these pipelines. Watch.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Notice how he phrased that. And he's the president. Phrase things by accident, particularly when he's reading off cards. He should do it. They thought this through. And yet those watching, very much including us, didn't take Biden seriously when he said it. This is the president who has declared climate change the most pressing emergency in the history of the world. This is the man who lectures you about using a wood stove or driving an SUV because of its emissions. This is the guy who spent billions trying to mitigate cow flatulence because methane. Would that guy really blow up a methane pipeline in the middle of the Baltic Sea? It was hard to imagine. That would be an unimaginably reckless act. That would be the kind of thing you would do if you wanted to start a nuclear war. It would be insane. And yet, in retrospect, it's obvious they were thinking about this because Joe Biden wasn't the only person to suggest it. Toria Nuland at the State Department said pretty much the very same thing. Nuland is a lifelong war cheerleader. She worked to bring about the Iraq invasion, never apologized, kept going. She helped engineer the coup that overthrew the Ukrainian government some years back. So capable, clearly she's capable of anything. But environmental terrorism, even for Toria Nuland, that seemed too much, too extreme. And yet here she is in January.
With regard to Nord Stream 2, we continue to have very strong and clear conversations with our German allies, and I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
One way or the other, we'll stop Nord Stream. Now, looking back, those words seem chilling 8 months later as natural gas pours into the Baltic Sea and into the atmosphere. So you have to ask, could the Biden administration really do something like this? We can't say for sure. We don't know for sure. We can tell you that close allies of the Biden White House believe they certainly did do it. Radek Sikorski is a Polish politician. He's chairman of the EU-USA delegation in the European Parliament. He's connected. He's also the husband of regime stenographer Ann Applebaum of The Atlantic magazine. Sikorski is so close to Joe Biden that he's got a picture of the two of them together in his Twitter profile. So when the pipelines blew up, Sikorski responded immediately. And here's what he wrote. Thank you, USA. So once again, did the Biden administration really do this? It's hard to believe. Given that it's an atrocity, it's effectively an act of terrorism, we don't want to make that accusation. But we should tell you that, maybe not coincidentally, today, a brand new pipeline was unveiled, a pipeline that carries non-Russian natural gas in roughly the same area as Nord Streams 1 and 2. This is called the Baltic Pipe. It was inaugurated in Poland. It will carry natural gas from Norway through Denmark to Poland and other countries nearby. And it's likely to do very well since now it has less competition. Making sense? What does the White House say about this? How are they accounting for what happened today? Well, they're not exactly enthusiastically denying responsibility for it. Instead, they're looking at the upside. Here's the president's publicist noting that the destruction of yet another energy pipeline is yet another opportunity for you to buy an electric car.
As you all know, these pipelines weren't pumping gas into Europe at this time. NS2 was never operational, as you guys know. NS1 has not been operational for weeks because Putin has weaponized energy, and we have said this many times before. This just drives home the importance of our efforts to work together to get alternative gas supplies to Europe and to support efforts to reduce gas consumption and accelerate true energy independence by moving to clean energy economy.
Oh, moving to clean energy, say the people who very may well be responsible for letting methane into the Baltic Sea and into the atmosphere at a scale that most people can't imagine. The people lecturing you about your SUV may have blown up a natural gas pipeline and created one of the great catastrophes of our time in its effect on the environment. If they did this, this will be one of the craziest, most destructive things any American administration has ever done. But it would also be totally consistent with what they do. What do? They destroy. These people build nothing, not one thing. Instead, they tear down and they desecrate, from historic statues to the Constitution to energy infrastructure. And no one in Congress is trying to stop any of it. They're just preparing for the inevitable fallout. Tonight, the Senate just advanced a spending bill with $35 million for the Department of Energy to, quote, prepare for and respond to potential nuclear and radiological incidents in Ukraine. What? The spending bill also brings the total U.S. expenditure on Ukraine, the war, but also funding its government and energy for Ukraine, to $67 billion on the eve of what could be a massive economic disruption. Here, to our economy, $67 billion. How much is that? Well, it's more than Russia's entire military budget last year. And Congress is expected to fully pass the bill later this week, with Republicans nodding along like the zombies they are. What will be the effect of this? Every action has a reaction, equal and opposite. Blow up the Nord Stream pipelines? Okay, we've entered a new phase, one in which the United States is directly at war with the largest nuclear power in the world. Doesn't mean it'll go nuclear immediately, but it does suggest there could be consequences. If we actually blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, why wouldn't Russia sever undersea internet cables? What would happen if they did that? What would happen if banks in London couldn't communicate with banks in New York? Just that one piece of it, leaving aside its potential effects on our power grid. But let's just say the banks couldn't communicate with each other for one day. What would the economic effect of that be? Oh, it would cascade downward into your house. We could have an actual collapse. We could wind up very quickly in third world conditions. Those are the stakes. Have the people behind this, the geniuses like Toria Nuland, considered the effects? Maybe they have. Maybe that was the point. Tulsi Gabbard is a former member of Congress from Hawaii who, from the very first day, from February 24th, when this war began, has been saying the exact same thing, which is the stakes are very high here. Maybe we should acknowledge that before we proceed heedlessly forward. We're honored to have her join us again tonight. Congresswoman, thank you so much for coming on. What do you make of this?
We're reminded once again, Tucker, that we are unfortunately being led by leaders who are selfish and short-sighted and don't care about the American people. They are leading us further and further into war without understanding one of the most basic tenets and characteristics of war, which is it is unpredictable. Once that first shot is fired, once that first punch is thrown, the predictable nature of things, you can plan for things, but it by nature becomes unpredictable. And so they're like, oh my gosh, this thing has become sabotage. Well, yeah, war is unpredictable. The thing that is not unpredictable, however, is the cost of war, the suffering, the devastation, the destruction, the death that is caused by it. And so the real question for the American people and for us to ask our leaders is how much suffering will we have to endure here in this country and for people around the world? Because as you've so clearly stated, we see a sabotage of an energy pipeline today. What's next? Is it access to the internet? Is it satellites that are connected to GPS that power virtually all parts of our life and also our weapon systems? Go on down the line and we end up with this potential nuclear outcome. And so, our leaders are saying, well, hey, we can't do anything. This is all in Putin's hands. Well, guess what? The United States, our leaders and European leaders are the ones fueling and funding this war. So they have a heck of a lot of leverage to be able to push for a ceasefire, negotiated outcome, and an end to this war, and to actually fight for peace and prosperity. And we need to know that if they're not doing that, and they aren't right now, then what they are doing is pushing for more destruction, more war, and therefore a lack of peace and prosperity and more suffering for us and people around the world.
If it turns out that the Biden administration actually blew up a natural gas pipeline or okayed someone else's sabotage of that pipeline, Shouldn't there be a federal law that prevents them from lecturing the rest of us about climate change ever again?
I don't have the evidence of who was responsible for this. There will be consequences if that is ever found out. But we have the reality of what we're dealing with right before us today, which is if we continue down this path, we may end up with a nuclear holocaust. And so for us and for millions of people around the world, what are we going to do about it? We've got to call on our leaders to actually take a stand and fight for peace, fight for prosperity, fight for our future.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of like your kids to be able to grow up and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Stuff like that.
Yeah, stuff like that. I appreciate you coming on. As always, thank you.
Thank you.